You must have heard about the petrodollar. It's a combination of two words, petroleum and dollars. Global oil trade takes place using the US dollar. The US dollar is the world's reserve currency as well as a global benchmark of sorts. That's why forex reserves of most countries are maintained in US dollars. Since the dollar is the world's reserve and benchmark currency, crude oil transactions are done using it. That gives the United States a lot of power over global trade and financial transactions. Countries now increasingly view the USA's dollar hegemony as a threat. Washington can weaponize this hegemony to hurt any country, like it did when it froze hundreds of billions of dollars held by Russia as reserves in the US. So, what is the world doing about the petrodollar system? How do countries intend to end the domination of the dollar? And should the US be worried? Hello and welcome. This is Sanveer Singh Ranhotra and you're watching First Post. Let's tackle the last question first. Yes, the US needs to be very worried. The petrodollar system has not been challenged in decades. Before we get to that, how did the US dollar become so powerful in the first place? Saudi Arabia has traded its oil exclusively using the US dollar since 1974. That was the year Riyadh signed a deal with the United States to use only the dollar for oil trade in exchange for solid security guarantees. This marks the birth of the petrodollar. This further strengthened the dollar's status as a reserve currency. Today, the dollar's tight grip on global trade and its status as the world's reserve currency is being viewed with increasing suspicion by a host of countries. This has led to talk of de-dollarization. This is not just a dangerous concept, but a dangerous idea for any political leader to have. The United States has gone to war to protect its dollar hegemony all the way from the Gulf War in the 1990s, the brutal ouster of Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq, the absolute obliteration of Gaddafi in Libya, to the 8-year-long war with the Assad regime in Syria. All these regimes had one thing in common. They dared to challenge the USA's petrodollar hegemony and paid a heavy price for it. But this time, the challenge the US faces is not from some Arab nation. The challenge is coming from the second largest economy in the world, China. China's ambitions go beyond just being the most dominant economy. It wants to replace the United States as the leader of a new world order. You see, last week was something straight out of USA's worst nightmares. China's Xi flew into Riyadh in a pompous state visit intended to boost Beijing's ties with West Asian countries. Things got interesting when Xi Jinping told Gulf Arab leaders on Friday that China would work to buy oil and gas using the Chinese yuan. The Chinese president also said that his country will, and I quote, make full use of the Shanghai Petroleum and National Gas Exchange as a platform to carry out yuan settlement of oil and gas trade. China will continue to import a large amount of crude oil from the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, expand imports of liquefied natural gas, strengthen the engineering services in oil and gas upstream development, and the cooperation in storage, transportation, and refining. China is Saudi Arabia's largest trading partner with bilateral trade worth $87.3 billion in 2021. In fact, it's the world's largest importer of crude and most of its supplies come from Saudi Arabia. China purchases around 18% of all its oil from Saudi Arabia. In the first 10 months of this year itself, China bought oil worth $55.52 billion from Saudi Arabia. That's a large volume. Imagine that transaction not being done using dollars.
Is that for a long time, Saudi Arabia has teased that it could perhaps start selling its oil in yuan to those Chinese buyers. Do you see that as a material risk? It's something that often comes up in conversation during times of tension between the US and Saudi Arabia. Are we going to see oil priced in yuan as this strategic pivot across the region and China's push into the American sphere of influence continues?
I think it's already happening, and I wrote about it a lot in my book, De-Dollarization. I think that this trend is already beginning. There's no reason why two countries that already have vast exposure to the US dollar should maintain their trade in a third-party currency. The Saudis have a lot to buy from China. China has a lot to buy from Saudi Arabia. Why should they transact in a third-party currency and incur all of these exchange rate costs and so forth? It's much more natural for them to trade in their own currencies or engage in barter deals so that Chinese send their infrastructure companies to Saudi Arabia, and in exchange Saudi Arabia sends oil. So there are a lot of models that could apply here. But I certainly think that even though nobody wants to make a big noise about the de-dollarization issue because that's such a sensitive issue for the United States, I think that this is sort of in the subtext of a lot of what's going on here. Don't forget that both countries, both China and Saudi Arabia, have been shocked by what they've seen the Americans and the Europeans doing to the Russians in terms of freezing central bank assets and so forth. That's something that really shook them because, you know, today it's Russia, tomorrow it's me. So that certainly has impact on their decision making, and I think the de-dollarization is already starting to happen in many relationship between not only between China and Saudi Arabia, but also other countries that are looking to diversify their foreign exchange portfolio and transition more and more of their trade to alternative currencies.
Statistic you brought up, 10% of the global economy is under sanction by the United States. And it's not just Saudi that's having these talks now with China. We've heard India talking about this. There's any number of countries probably looking at their own situations and wondering how they can begin to insulate themselves from the potential of becoming part of that 10%, or even perhaps if that 10% grows even bigger. But the question I have for you is, you know, as an advisor to the U.S. Energy Security Council, how are these warnings going down? What is the U.S. actually doing in response to this? Because the consequences of de-dollarization would be catastrophic for the U.S. economy and potentially for the global economy too, because institutionally the rest of the world is probably not set up to accommodate a de-dollarized world. So what are the policy responses here?
First of all, let me correct. It's 10% of the countries of the world. It means 1 out of 10 countries is under some U.S. sanctions. But it may be even, if you add China into this, then it's definitely more than 10% of the world economy. What is the U.S. doing? Look, I think that there is a great disconnect between the mindset of the American political class, that is the various administrations, and particularly Congress, a lack of awareness of their action. It's like a bunch of kids running around with guns, shooting all over the place without realizing what they're actually doing, without looking at the cumulative impact of all of this. Every congressman has a pet project. Everyone wants to sanction someone. But you have to look at the cumulative effect of all of this. And the world is paying attention. And all of this is happening at the time that the U.S. is increasing its debt like there is no tomorrow. When you run a deficit of $2 or $3 trillion a year, this money needs to come from somewhere. And you're expecting all those countries to finance your deficit. So those two objectives they contradict each other. On the one hand, you are sanctioning right and left. On the other hand, you want countries to buy your treasuries and finance your debt. That's not a sustainable scenario.
It has taken us a long time to really begin to come together to dismantle the Berlin Conference, which, of course, for those who think, oh, Berlin Conference is a thing of the past, think again. As long as we have a country called Togo, as long as we have a country called Congo Brazzaville, Eswatini, Malawi, those small countries, even Nigeria or the big ones, Kenya, Egypt, Morocco, they cannot survive on their own. As long as we're talking about the little bitty individual African countries, we are never going to realize the dream of a united Africa that speaks with one voice. And until we dismantle some of those borders, until we begin to wake ourselves up as a people, until we begin to realize that the colonizers and the rule of divide and conquer left us feeling inferior, supremacy, white supremacy was introduced from the very onset. When the colonizers came to Africa, we were taught to believe that everything African was bad, everything European was better. And we still continue to suffer from that mentality. So yes, while we demand that the West and those who don't look like us Africans treat us equally, realize that we are human beings just like they are, we too as Africans, we have a lot of work to do on a personal level, where we must also believe, truly believe, that we are equal to everybody else on earth, and that we are capable. That also is a disease that we need to realize as Africans. Let's wake up and realize that white people are not superior to us. Chinese are not superior to us. We are just as good as anybody else. That is a serious challenge, because we still have people, even when you look at issues that we could stand up as a people and push back. You see ministers from the Western world going to Africa, and they basically can, I've seen them say some of the most ridiculous things to the Africans. Right. And instead of the Africans pushing back and saying, hey, hold it, this is not going to fly. Instead, the Africans are afraid, just inherently fear of the white person, without any, for no good reason whatsoever, except that we have been programmed to feel inferior. So on an individual basis, we continue to speak the gospel of truth. We continue to shed the light as to the brainwashing that the African has been put through, wherein lies the problem. When you look at what is being done at the World Bank, for example, the Bretton Woods institutions, the frivolous loans, countries that have never defaulted on their loan repayments, and right. Yet they're still given large interest rates. Why? Countries like the United States that don't need any help, right. They get loans at zero interest rates. You look at the issue. I'm glad President Biden, I hear he's going to be talking about having the AU as the 51st member of the G20. Well, let's also take it to the next level. Let's go to the United Nations. Let's have Africa, 1.4 right. billion people. They need to come to the table. Let's African Union be the 6th member of the 5-member UN Security Council. You can't just totally disregard 1.4 billion people because you've gotten away with it for centuries. Well, guess what? Game is over. Africans are waking up. Africans are beginning to realize and understand the game that have been played. Unfortunately, we don't have that critical mass of people who are continuously going to speak truth to power. Right. The good thing with the story of Africa is ours, we are coming from a position of righteousness, right. A position of truth, a position of facts. Right. Those are constants. They don't change. Let's continue to give the world an overdose of our truth, but at the same time, while we are doing so and demanding a world that is fair, that is just, and free of right. racism, bigotry, and hate, we must also work on our own development and our own awakening as a people.
Talk to me. Nobody thought this was possible, but it is true. The Federal Reserve is on the brink of bankruptcy. I'm going to explain this to you in one simple, fast step. Let's start by going over the fact that the Federal Reserve, the backbone of the global financial system, will be technically insolvent within weeks. And if you don't believe me, we're going to go to the Fed's balance sheet in a moment, and I'm going to prove it to you.
Hello, this is Chris Ben Israel. Thanks for listening to this commentary. Today's video will be another in the series of the petrodollar. Yay! So today I'll be talking about the international currency crisis, the collapse of the petrodollar system, and the creation of the new world currency order coming from China and the BRICS nations. So if you haven't already heard, or if you haven't been following the news lately, Xi Jinping, president of China, recently flew over to Saudi Arabia to visit with Mohammed bin Salman, the Prince of Saudi Arabia, and his father, the king. I don't exactly remember the king's name, but the king of Saudi Arabia and the prince basically had a meeting with the president of China. Why is this significant? Well, recently, Washington has been pissing off Saudi Arabia and other allies, but also mainly the Saudis. And the Saudis have, it seems, finally grown spine enough to turn against Washington and join an alliance with China, Russia, and the BRICS nations. Who are BRICS? Well, if you don't already know, BRICS is an acronym which stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, which is an alliance of countries, an economic alliance, soon to be blossoming military alliance, and a growing alliance of countries that seek to dominate the world via world trade, basically economics. Saudi Arabia has always been, or not always, for many, many years, basically for the past 50 or 60 years, has been a key player and a key partner to Washington, to America, even though it doesn't seem like that would be the case, with Americans harboring anti-Islamic ideas and generally unfavorable sentiments towards Muslims in general, though that is a generalization and not representative of every American. It is true that Islamophobia is not uncommon in America. This, I think, may be part of the reason why Saudi Arabia has also decided to switch sides, because Americans don't look favorably upon Islam. That's all speculation. Of course, no one came out and said that publicly, but that's just my own personal speculation on the matter. Either way you slice it, Washington has expended pretty much all of their political goodwill, and currently there is an international coalition of countries preparing to revolt against the US dollar system. Allow me to read from Luft and Korin's book, De-Dollarization, The Revolt Against the Dollar and the Rise of a New Financial World Order. The marriage of oil and the dollar, the petrodollar, goes back to a 1975 agreement between Nixon administration and the House of Saud, an agreement that proved to be one of the most consequential in modern history. During the late 1960s and early 1970s, the United States was running substantial deficits caused by the Vietnam War and the Johnson administration's Great Society-related spending. These deficits grew even bigger thanks to the oil price hike resulting from the 1973 oil embargo. 3 years before the agreement with the Saudis, the Nixon administration was already in the middle of a process of decoupling the dollar from the international gold standard, which governed world finance since Bretton Woods. Under the agreement reached in 1975 between then Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and the Saudis, any country that sought to purchase oil from the oil kingdom would be required to do so in dollars and in dollars alone. In exchange for Saudi Arabia's willingness to denominate its oil sales exclusively in dollars, the United States offered the vulnerable Saudis long-term security guarantees, which includes protection of their oil fields. This commitment to shield the House of Saud from foreign and international adversaries has been put to the test many times over the years, from the 1979 attack on the Grand Mosque in Mecca through Saddam Hussein's 1990 invasion of Kuwait, to the recent rise of Iran as an existential nuclear threat to Saudi Arabia. By 1975, all the other members of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, also agreed to trade their oil in dollars. This agreement allowed OPEC members to plow through their surplus dollars back to the U.S. economy through investments and the purchase of U.S. treasuries, which in turn allowed the U.S. government, then facing declining GNP and soaring unemployment, to finance its deficit and bolster its military. Pretty much to sum it up, Saudi Arabia's willingness to work with the United States has been integral to the United States' power in the world and hegemony over geopolitics, especially in regards to the world reserve currency and the ability to basically print money out of thin air. Because, of course, as long as countries need oil, they need dollars to pay for it, which keeps dollars in circulation in the world economy. Now, however, Saudi Arabia has seen fit to build an alliance with China, and instead of selling their oil in US dollars, they're going to sell their oil in the Chinese currency, the yuan. Doing this will undercut the value of the US dollar, cause an international currency crisis, and probably be the end of the American currency, the dollar. I mean, not the end, like it'll probably still be used as a regional currency, but it'll be devalued severely in comparison to the other currencies traded on the international market. It won't be the reserve currency anymore, and China will probably become the new world reserve currency. Or perhaps there will no longer be one reserve currency. Perhaps the BRICS nations will just switch to a basket of currencies that they trade amongst themselves with no single currency in reserve. Or perhaps they'll switch to gold reserves. Anyway, the point is, the jig is up, the party's over, the US dollar system is over. It's kind of crazy being alive in this time period. It's like, how am I literally born right before the collapse of an empire? Crazy shit. I shall now read more from De-Dollarization. Why would China's Petro Yuan fare better? The simple reason for China's optimism is the vastness of the Chinese market and the growth in demand for energy. Already the world's #1 oil importer, China's oil demand is expected to rise by 30% by 2040. It is also on track to become the largest consumer of liquefied natural gas as it implements policies to reduce its coal use. To boost support for the Petro Yuan, the Chinese government is increasingly forcing state-owned companies to purchase oil using new contracts. To boost the Petro Yuan, Beijing could compel its energy-rich neighbors like Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, and of course, Russia, to shift their trading to Petro Yuan. Isolated countries like Iran and Venezuela will also welcome the option of trading oil in yuans, especially if this translates to political and economic support. China could also use the infrastructure projects of the Belt and Road Initiative, deep water ports, oil and gas terminals, transnational pipelines, and rail links to build support for the Petro Yuan. The bigger unknown is the Petro Yuan's acceptance in the GCC and Asia Pacific regions, China's own backyard. In the Middle East, trading oil in yuan is a welcome idea. In fact, a plan to issue contracts denominated in yuan was a part of the agenda in the China-Saudi Economic Forum. Pretty much, as countries around the world start to join the BRICS alliance, especially major oil exporters like Saudi Arabia, naturally they're going to trade their oil and other commodities in their own currencies instead of the US dollar. Thereby, they can cut out the risk of being sanctioned by the US government and incurring exchange fees and other regulations that are dictated by the Federal Reserve Bank. So yeah, pretty much de-dollarization is here, folks. I wouldn't be surprised if the dollar would be officially collapsed by 2025 or severely devalued to its current value. It's already been devalued. Like here in America, the price for everything has gone up exponentially. You can't buy a freaking candy bar for $1 anymore, even though that used to be the standard price for a candy bar. Now it's like $2, almost $3 now. Gas, forget about it. $5 a gallon here in Washington State. I mean, it's pretty much obvious that the Federal Reserve has lost control of the system. There's pretty much nothing they can do about it. I mean, it all depends on how fast people accept that reality. I myself knew that something like this was going to happen for a long time. I just, you never expect it to be public knowledge until it's public, Basically, China and Saudi Arabia signing an agreement like this pretty much spells the end for the US dollar. But hold on, it gets worse than that, folks, because not only has Washington and the Biden administration pissed off Saudi Arabia, they also basically are losing not all, but most of their political influence in Africa during a time when having influence in that continent is very important, because Russia and especially China are building huge economic infrastructure projects and building ties with the African countries, while America, Washington, well, they're getting cut out of all of this. So leaders from the African nations, right, they come to Washington to have a meeting with Joe Biden to call the African summit with the Americas, and Joe Biden offers them a minuscule amount of money compared to the infrastructure that the Chinese offered. About I want to say it's 100 billion. But for Ukraine, they gave them basically the same amount, even though Ukraine is only one country. Like, so it just goes to show that Washington's priorities are completely mismatched. Even Africa has had enough with U.S. imperialism. And what we're seeing here basically is a global revolt against the American agenda and U.S. dollar hegemony, pretty much American hegemony over the world. Yeah, but I'm probably going to wrap up the video here. Shit, it's kind of just, this is basically just a documentary of the collapse of society. I mean, I also like reading from the books I bought and turning it basically into a video essay type format. I think I'm going to actually try and learn Mandarin, because China's going to take over the world, guys. And I want to be able to speak Chinese so I can make a bunch of money in the future, or at least do business or trade or whatever. I don't want to just be relegated to my limited worldview, like see everything through the lens of English, which limits your perspective. Like, I want to grow. I want to become stronger. I want to become multilingual. I can already speak Japanese, but I want to learn Hebrew, want to learn Mandarin. And I don't know, I'm kind of just rambling at this point. But yeah, the power dynamics of the world are shifting. And I just think that a lot of karma and a lot of unlearned lessons are coming to hit the America home pretty hard. And it's going to be probably a crazy next couple years. Who knows what's going to happen next year? The channel's been growing pretty good. I think I got like 7 or 8 subscribers this year, which is pretty good. Thanks for everyone who's been listening and supporting the channel so far. I really appreciate it. God bless everyone. Take care. And yeah, everyone have a good day.